65% of ordinary people were willing to electrocute a stranger to death. Not criminals, not psychopaths. Ordinary teachers, engineers, and fathers, people exactly like you. And they did it simply because someone in a white coat told them to. In 1961, a psychologist named Stanley Milgram ran an experiment that was supposed to take a few weeks. Instead, it produced results so disturbing that it changed how scientists understood human nature forever. The findings were so uncomfortable that several countries moved to ban this type of research entirely. In this video, we're going to cover what actually happened inside that experiment, why the results broke every prediction experts made, what it reveals about the hidden wiring in your brain, and why the most unsettling part isn't what those participants did. It's what you would probably do too. By the end, you'll never look at authority the same way again. Yale University, 1961. Participants were recruited through a newspaper ad. Ordinary people. They were told they were taking part in a study on learning and memory. Nothing alarming. They arrived, met another participant, and drew lots to decide roles. One person would be the teacher, the other the learner. What they didn't know was that the draw was rigged. The real participant always became the teacher. The learner was always an actor. The learner was taken to a separate room and strapped into a chair. The teacher sat in front of a large electric shock generator, a machine with 30 switches ranging from 15 volts all the way to 450 volts. The switches were labeled in groups: slight shock, moderate shock, strong shock, very strong shock, intense shock, extreme intensity shock, and at the very end, simply marked XXX. The task was simple. The teacher would read word pairs to the learner. If the learner got an answer wrong, the teacher was instructed to administer a shock and increase the voltage with every wrong answer. The learner wasn't actually being shocked, but the teacher didn't know that. What the teacher heard through the wall was a carefully scripted performance. At 75 volts, grunting. At 120 volts, shouting that the shocks were painful. At 150 volts, demanding to be released. At 285 volts, an agonized scream. After 330 volts, complete silence. When teachers hesitated, the experimenter in the white coat gave 4 scripted prompts. Please continue. The experiment requires that you continue. It is absolutely essential that you continue. You have no other choice, you must go on. No threats, no physical coercion. Just calm, firm instructions from a man in a lab coat. Milgram asked psychiatrists beforehand to predict how far participants would go. They estimated that less than 1% would reach the maximum voltage. Only the most pathological individuals, they said. People with serious psychological disorders. Not 1%, 65%. The psychiatric community was wrong by an enormous margin. And that gap is the most important thing to understand here. The people who participated were not unusual. They were not sadistic. Many of them showed extreme distress during the experiment, sweating, trembling, laughing nervously, begging the experimenter to check on the learner. One participant had a full seizure from stress. They clearly did not want to hurt anyone, and yet they continued. Milgram repeated the experiment over 20 variations. He changed the location from Yale to a rundown office building. Obedience dropped slightly, but remained high. He moved the learner into the same room as the teacher. Obedience dropped, but 40% still reached maximum voltage. He made the teacher physically push the learner's hand onto a shock plate. Still 30% complied fully. He also ran the experiment with female participants. The results were identical. The finding was not a fluke of location, gender, or social class. It was something far more fundamental, something embedded in how human beings respond to authority structures. Milgram called it the agentic state. A psychological shift that happens when a person sees themselves as an instrument of someone else's will, rather than an independent agent responsible for their own actions. In plain terms, when someone in authority takes responsibility, your brain quietly transfers moral ownership to them. You stop being the one making the decision. You become the hand that carries out someone else's choice. And it happens without you noticing. This is where the experiment stops being about 1961 and starts being about you. The obedience Milgram recorded wasn't caused by cruelty or weakness. It was caused by deeply wired social instincts that exist in almost every human brain. Instincts that, for most of human history, were genuinely useful. Deference to authority kept early human groups organized. It allowed cooperation at scale. When a leader made a decision, having everyone comply quickly and without debate often meant the difference between survival and collapse. The brain that questioned authority too often got the group killed, so evolution selected for compliance. It became the default. The problem is that this ancient wiring doesn't distinguish between a tribal elder making a life or death call and a man in a white coat telling you to press a button. The uniform, the title, the institutional setting, these are enough. Your brain reads legitimate authority, and the compliance system activates. Milgram also identified something he called counterforces, the internal resistance participants felt. The discomfort, the sweating, the protests. Those were real, but they were consistently overridden by two things: the physical and social distance from the victim and the presence of an authority figure absorbing moral responsibility. When the learner was in a separate room, out of sight, compliance was highest. When the teacher could see the learner's face, it dropped. When the experimenter left the room and gave instructions by phone, it dropped further still. Proximity to consequences forces the brain back into independent moral agency. Distance from consequences lets the agentic state take hold. This is why atrocities throughout history have almost always involved bureaucratic distance. Layers of hierarchy that separate the decision-maker from the act and the actor from the victim. The desk is the shock generator. The memo is the white coat. Here is the part nobody wants to sit with. You would likely have complied too, not because you are evil, not because you are weak, but because the same wiring exists in your brain. The same agentic shift happens to you every day, in offices, in institutions, in classrooms, whenever someone with perceived authority frames a request as necessary, expected, or required. You feel the discomfort, the internal resistance, and then, more often than you'd like to admit, you continue anyway. Milgram's experiment has been partially replicated several times in the decades since. The wiring has not changed. The antidote Milgram himself identified was surprisingly simple: proximity and personal responsibility. The closer you are to the consequences of your actions, the more you see the face of who is affected, the harder it becomes to defer. The moment you say out loud, "I am responsible for this decision," the agentic state collapses. Awareness is not immunity, but it is the only thing that has ever been shown to reliably interrupt the pattern. Here is what stays with me. The psychiatrists, the experts, predicted that less than 1% of people would go all the way. They were wrong by 6,400%. Not because they misjudged the participants, because they fundamentally misunderstood the power of situation over character. We all believe we would have stopped. We all believe we are the exception. That belief, that comfortable certainty about our own moral backbone, is precisely what makes us vulnerable. The most disturbing thing about the Milgram experiment is not what those participants did in 1961. It's that the experiment is still running. The lab is just bigger now. So here's the question I'll leave you with. The last time someone in authority told you to do something you weren't sure about, did you stop and ask why? Or did you just continue? If this got under your skin, it should. Like and subscribe if you want more videos that make you genuinely uncomfortable about how your own brain works. I'll see you in the next one.